Okay.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming to our webinar tonight on System Thinking for Interpreters by Anna Witter Merithew. I am Carrie White and I will be emceeing tonight. I am the program coordinator for the Marie Center out of Denver, Colorado. Captioning and interpreters are provided. Windows for the speaker and the interpreters can be closed or sized to create your personal viewing environment. If you'd like to enlarge the video window, click on the side or the corner of the window and drag it out to make it bigger. If you're going to utilize the interpreters, you may need to enlarge the window for the interpreter, which may interfere with your ability to see the PowerPoint. Therefore, if you have not already printed the PowerPoint that was sent you earlier today, you can access the PowerPoint after the webinar through the attendees materials link or send it or get it from the attachment through the email that I sent out earlier today. The captioning will appear at the bottom of the screen. If you have technical issues, please refer to the help websites and phone number that were sent in the email previously today. If those do not work for you, please use the chat function and a Marie staff member will try to assist you. Today's questions for the presenter will be in the chat function. But please write down your questions and wait for Anna to ask for the questions, and then at that time when she asks for your questions, type them in the chat function. All attendees are muted, so you can only use the chat box function for your questions. After the webinar, I'll talk again about how to apply for CEUs and a few housekeeping things, so please stay tuned after Anna finishes her presentation. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Anna and let her start her amazing presentation that she has for us tonight.
Thank you, Carrie. Good evening, everyone. So this is the first in a series of 10 webinars that the NCIEC is going to be hosting, addressing various aspects of interpreting in vocational rehabilitation settings. This evening's webinar is not specific to VR. It's really a foundation presentation on the topic of system thinking, and it will serve as the foundation for next month's seminar, which looks at vocational rehabilitation as a system. So as I mentioned, this series of webinars is being hosted by the National Consortium of Interpreter Education Centers. Next slide, Carrie. Thank you. So there are 6 centers that comprise the NCIEC. We need to go back one slide, Carrie. So I'm hoping that you're going to get to see a slide that has a map of the United States and shows where the 6 centers are located that comprise the NCIEC. 5 of them are regional and 1 is a national center. You can go to that next slide now, Carrie. Folks, we're using a new platform this evening. We, for some time, have been conducting webinars through the National Clearinghouse for Rehabilitation Training Materials, and that particular service is not going to be available to us long term. So we are trying to work with a new platform that is called GoToTraining. And we're trying to incorporate all of these various pieces of captioning and filming this so we can archive it, showing you the PowerPoint, making sure that you can see the interpreters and that you can also see the speaker. So we ask for your indulgence as we're still working to pull all of these pieces together, because we have to manage all of these functions that at one time were managed through this other entity. So in order to make all of these pieces come together, Carrie is having to manage my PowerPoint, and so it may be from time to time that we're having to negotiate which slide is being shown. So thanks for your patience. So the mission, the overarching mission of the consortium is to increase the quantity and quality of interpreters nationwide. And to achieve that mission, we collaborate with lots of different stakeholders, including interpreter education programs, interpreter educators, practitioners, consumers, government agencies such as administrative offices of the court or commissions for the deaf, entities like vocational rehabilitation, and other stakeholders as well. And we provide a variety of services that are indicated on this slide, such as technical assistance. We offer education programs like this one tonight, as well as online and other forms of delivery of more long-term training events. We develop and distribute training resources, research, and other related activities to support the field of interpreting and interpreter education. So the regional centers engage in providing services like technical assistance within their region, but we also all collaborate in cross-center collaborations on projects that have a national impact. So one such project relates to interpreting in vocational settings, vocational rehabilitation settings. And as part of that project, the NCIC has developed a series of 5 professional development modules that are currently being offered online through the Marie Center. And you can learn more about those modules by visiting the NCIC or Marie website. If you find this content from this webinar and the subsequent webinars of interest, they are much more fully explored in the modules. So the content for this webinar and the future webinars is drawn from those modules that we have developed for online delivery. Next slide. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide you with a framework for systems thinking so that you can better appreciate how systems thinking impacts our work as interpreters. Systems thinking offers us another way to think about what we do and another way to approach our work. And it offers us a much more expanded, less interpreter-centric view of our work, one that enables us to better understand the way that organizations and agencies, institutions work, how they function, and how we can better fit in with the system as it is. Next slide. All of the information isn't on the slide, Carrie. I'm looking for the graphic. There it is. Great. So why do we need other ways of thinking about our work or talking about our work? Well, we know that systems thinking, along with a number of other approaches, is one of several current contributions to our field. in an effort to help us more fully conceptualize and fulfill our role as interpreters. And it's because practitioners have long struggled with managing our role, the way that we have historically conceptualized our role, and the way that that conceptualization actually fits within the midst of human interactions has not always proved effective. It's not always proved to be one that results in the outcomes that we want to achieve. So we know that at the core of interpreting is relationship, right? We're present to allow consumers of our services to connect and to interact with one another to achieve whatever goals they have set for that interaction. Yet often our behavior and our actions restrict the development of relationship between consumers and also between us and consumers. Both deaf and hearing consumers report perceiving interpreters as aloof, as disengaged, as detached. In 2005, Dr. Leilani Johnson and I published a text that's called Towards Competent Practice, Conversations with Stakeholders. And this was this book, which is published by the RID, reports on data and a research project that we engaged in to collect information from various stakeholders about what they thought that were the skills and competencies, the knowledge, the abilities that interpreters needed to have to be the field. And we were really surprised to find out how particularly deaf people and employers perceived interpreters. This notion of us being aloof, disengaged, detached, even sometimes from their perspective, flat out rude. And so it seems that there are times when we find ourselves working so hard to remain non-obtrusive, non-intrusive, and to sustain the appearance of neutrality to such a degree that we create unnecessary distance between ourselves and consumers, and consequently between consumers with one another. So then as a result, we find ourselves at odds with members of the general society, particularly those who are unfamiliar with deaf people, their life experience, and our work as interpreters. And this is some of then what leads to this antagonistic or hostile way of relating to the broader society that sometimes is evident in the work of interpreters. Next slide. Certainly there, the lack of awareness by society in general regarding how we work, what our work is about, is a source of great frustration, right? It's not uncommon to hear interpreters talk about how fed up they are with hearing people who just don't get it, or when meeting with resistance to some entity to provide interpreting services, we're very quick to counter with reference to the ADA or other legal obligations that they have. And it's also not uncommon for interpreters to talk about the sense of internal conflict that they have between what they might see as needing to happen when they're interpreting versus what is actually happening. There seems to be a continuing disconnect between what we feel should be a part of our work, should be a part of our role, and perceptions about what is required or expected by the profession at large. So these feelings of discouragement and conflict make it very difficult for us to manage our role effectively. Certainly it inhibits our ability to express our role or apply our role in a way that is open and transparent and fosters relationship between all of the participants within the interpreted interaction. And the fact that we carry so much internal conflict about our work is one of the most telling signals that we have an incomplete or an insufficient conceptualization of what our role should be. So we continue to grow as a field and explore deeper ways of understanding our work. We seek a more accurate and effective way to conceptualize, understand what it is that we do. And systems thinking is one of several contributions to that. Next slide. So, oh, we were there, we're there, that's the one, Carrie, thank you. So as we begin to conceptualize when we began to conceptualize the role of sign language interpreters, we relied on the prevailing view of interpreters articulated in the law, you know, like for example, court interpreting, or that was applied to the field of spoken language interpretation. So in the case of court interpreting, this view is centered in what is often referred to as the equal footing doctrine. And this equal footing doctrine stipulates that an interpreter is to provide a level of access to a non-English speaking person that puts them on equal footing with someone who speaks English. They should provide no more or no less. And although I believe that equal footing and even that definition of equal footing could be much more broadly interpreted, what it generally means, historically it has meant a pretty literal interpretation, where you take what has been said and you just restructure it into the target language. Now, this view of interpreting may actually work in some situations where the non-English speaking person, whether that person is deaf or just speaks a language other than English, it certainly could work for someone who grew up with a native language and has gone through an educational system that they accessed through their native language and you know, delivered by individuals who were competent in their native language and with whom they shared a natural language with members of their family and their extended community. However, it's not a view that is compatible with the experience of most deaf people, because most deaf people do not typically come from families that know sign language. There's always the issue of delayed diagnosis of an individual's deafness. We know that deaf education is fraught with many issues regarding the communication competence of teachers, of interpreters in mainstream settings. So we can see that although the concept that the interpreter is non-intrusive, that the interpreter behaves as if they weren't there, so that the interaction would happen as if the interpreter were not there, we can see that in some instances, it may have been logical, but the concept and then the application of that concept to our work has really resulted in great conflict for us because it doesn't work. It's inconsistent with what we know about deaf people, what we know about language use within the deaf community, what we know about human interaction, what we know about cultural norms, particularly within the deaf community, and even cultural norms within the general society. Because for employers or consumers to see interpreters as rude, that perception was not restricted just to deaf people. It was actually more frequently a statement by individuals of the broader society who found this aloof, detached, disengaged, the interpreter sitting in a chair reading a magazine or reading a book or working on something else, waiting for someone to come. They found that level of detachment very counter to professional interactions and collaborated interactions centered in communication and relationship. So certainly some of our perspectives on interpreting have been faulty, and more recent, more emergent views of interpreting as a practice profession, and some of the work that has been done particularly in the area of spoken language interpreters in healthcare settings that talk about the interpreter as a co-participant, all seem to encourage us to look more deeply and to conceptualize more fully what is interpreting, what is that process in the midst of these human interactions, and how might we foster greater collaboration. Next slide. The impact of some of those historical roots is that, and also I think it comes in part from our own efforts to become clear about who we were, to establish ourselves, and to become clear about our practices and our professional acts, is that we've come to this place of where we have a very interpreter-centric view of our work. And unfortunately, that interpreter-centric view limits our access to a broader range of options, of strategies that are available to us for improving relationships, for building relationships, for improving our decision-making, for improving job satisfaction. And even when we may be open to some of these more current views of the work of interpreters and how to create a more collaborated context that is more open and transparent, even when we're open to that, our ways of behaving are so deeply ingrained in us that the shadows of invisibility, our efforts to remain invisible or detached or to behave as if we weren't really there, seem to continue to permeate what we do. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, systems thinking is one of the things that can help us move beyond this interpreter-centric view of our work and to look at our work as an important part of a broader process, a bigger process. So let's begin by talking about then what is a system. As indicated on the slide, a system is a collection of parts that function together interdependently to achieve an overall goal. Systems can be simple, like riding a bike, or they can be very complex, like nature. And system thinking recognizes that if one part of a system is not working right, so for example, the gear shift on a bicycle, then the entire system is going to be affected. As interpreters, we often engage in a single part of a system in which we are working. Like we're at that individual doctor's appointment, or we're going to court and we're handling what's before the court in a particular case on that day, or we're the substitute interpreter in a classroom that's talking about subject matter that on that day. But in each one of those instances, what's ever happening in that moment is tied to something bigger. It's tied to prior content, prior events where the information gathering was happening, or other appointments were occurring. And often the situations we go into are building on one another. As well, what's ever happening in the one event that we're a part of has impact for other parts of the system. So as systems thinker, we're certainly looking at the individual part of the system in which we find ourselves, and we consider what's happening in that moment. But we also seek to understand and appreciate how that part of the system works together with other parts of the system interdependently, and how the other parts of the system might be affected, or how those other parts of the system affect what's happening in that moment. Next slide. So there's different kinds of systems, and for the purpose of our discussion, for the purpose of interpreting, we're focused on human systems that are represented by organizations or entities that are socio-political in nature. So when I use that term socio-political, what I mean is the socio part means that it's of society, it relates to society. It's a system that's serving the interest of society. And the political part is that because it's a part of society and serving the interest of society, it is a system that typically has negotiated standards of operation. Often that includes government regulations. It often includes the necessity to comply with certain laws. And it also is a system that has a hierarchy of social relationships. And that hierarchy of social relationships involves issues of power and authority, lines of authority. And in the next webinar, we're going to look specifically at vocational rehabilitation as one of these socio-political systems. But other examples of socio-political systems are like the educational systems, K through 12 or higher ed, healthcare systems, the legal system, social service systems. So, as an interpreter, when we enter these systems, we often expect the system to adapt to us, to accommodate us. And certainly, we want them to change their way of being because we're there. And certainly, the inclusion of interpreters and deaf people may have implication on how the communication process regularly happens. But in reality, the interpreter is much more likely to have ongoing or regular contact with systems than the system is likely to have contact with deaf individuals or sign language interpreters, right? And so it's important that in order for us to create better collaboration with individuals who work within these systems, that we should understand the system more effectively, and we should seek ways to fit more naturally, more authentically into the system. So in other words, it's equally, if not more important, for us to understand the system and how it functions than it is for that system to understand us or our work. We wind up being a small part of what that system typically is dealing with, as opposed to that event that we're in the moment comprises all of what we're there to focus on, all of what we're there to do. Interpreters who think from this perspective are able to navigate their entry into and their way through the system much more seamlessly, and they're able to create better collaboration with the individuals in the system. So again, systems thinking expands the options that are available for us for how to behave, how to interface, how to find solutions to challenges. And so if you're familiar with the demand control schema, then it expands our controls for the demands, the challenges that might arise in interpreted events. Next slide. So these, oh, it looks like we lost the interpreters. Carrie, should I just wait for a bit, or should I continue?
Why don't you let us call and then hold on a moment and we will put it in a call and I'll be right back to you.
All right. Thank you everyone for being patient for just a moment so we can see if we can reconnect with our interpreters. Okay, great. Interpreters are back. Okay, so these socio-political systems are comprised of three primary components. People who do specific jobs and hold specific responsibilities and have varying levels of authority for the work that they do. Structures that form the overall organization of the system. And so by structures, I'm talking about like the personnel within the system, how it's organized. Like are the tasks and the work of the system organized around departments or work teams, or what's the structure by which it operates? And the third component is the processes, and the processes refers to the ways in which the work of the system is accomplished. You think about policies and procedures. And again, because in socio-political systems, the processes are often guided by external standards, government standards, by laws, then these rules and regulations form these policies and procedures that dictate how people function and behave within the system. But so often the processes can show up just by observing the way people function and the way the personnel in the system behave through their acts and through their practices. That will give you insight to policies and procedures that may exist in a book that's sitting on a shelf somewhere. So I'm going to talk about each one of these people, structures, and processes a little bit more. Next slide. So think about all the people that you might encounter within a single healthcare assignment. Each of those individuals that you encounter has training that's specific to what they do. So you're with a deaf patient who the doctor has sent to have an x-ray. Likely you've already had contact with the front desk, you've had contact with a nurse, you've had contact with a doctor, and now you make your way to the x-ray, to where the x-ray technologist is located. And he or she has authority to take those pictures, but he or she may not or does not have the authority or the training to read those x-rays and to report the findings. That work would be done by a radiologist, right? So understanding the role and the responsibilities of the personnel within that system in which you work can help you to interface with them more effectively. And should you need to ask for some type of assistance or to request certain information, then it can help you to identify the right person to whom you should make your requests. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, interpreters are overly concerned that system personnel understand our role and our responsibility. And perhaps this is tied to our efforts to restrict what people expect from us out of our concern that someone may want us to do something that we perceive as stepping out of our role. Because sometimes when we explain our role, it seems that we focus on all the things that we don't do, and we don't spend a lot of attention talking about what we do in a simple, clear way, right? Because in reality, as I said earlier, it's much more common for us to be interfacing with these professionals within systems than it is for them to be interfacing with us. So, you know, I think that if we can demonstrate more systems thinking, because we understand the system more, we can find more authentic ways of guiding people into what it is that we do and helping them to appreciate and understand the nature of our work. You know, so for example, the x-ray technologist greets you and the deaf person, and maybe this is their first encounter with a deaf person and an interpreter. And so, as often people do, she or he says something to the effect of, oh, okay, so how's this going to work? Or what do I need to do to make this work? And then this question offers a natural segue into a brief and useful description of how we can collaborate with them in the implementation of your role, of their role. You know, so we might respond by saying, well, while you are explaining to the patient the procedure and what it is you need them to do, I'm going to be very focused, and I'll be taking what you say and conveying that in sign language. And as the patient has questions that they need to ask you about the procedure or about the outcome or what happens next, you know, I'll be paying attention and taking that information and conveying it to you. And should I have any questions, I'll let you know, and so much more authentic than saying, starting off with, well, let me tell you, this is what my role is. We embed what it is we do within the context of what they do as a way to let them know this is how I appreciate what your work is, and I'm here to support your work, and it's going to happen pretty much the way It always happens for you, and if something out of the ordinary comes up, I'll let you know. I'll take responsibility for that. Next slide. So I guess some of you may just be on the phone versus actually seeing what's on the screen. So I should say the reason that I'm pausing is because I'm trying to allow time for people to read the PowerPoint. So again, then the structure refers to the framework, typically the hierarchical organization, its lines of authority, how information is communicated from one area to another area, and understanding who has the authority or the expertise or the knowledge to make decisions or convey information that an interpreter may need, like getting prep materials or authorizing a team interpreter or asking for clarification about a particular procedure as part of your preparation. That can help us, and it also helps members of the system too, because it saves time. So understanding the personnel structure within a system will assist you with that. And also, as the slide says, one of the aspects of structures is how information flows between levels of the system. So paying attention to this aspect, how is data collected, is a very important piece of insight that you can gain into systems and the way that it's structured. So for example, I'm thinking about in the organizations that I identified earlier, like schools and hospitals, healthcare systems, the legal system, etc. Just think about the role of paperwork, the role of forms. The structure is such that the paperwork becomes like a record, and it flows from one part of the system to another part of the system. And whether I follow a particular individual through all the various contacts they may have within a system or not, for sure that paperwork will, right? That record will. And so appreciating the importance of that record, the importance of it being accurate, is very helpful to us in the moment that I'm interpreting and one of those forms needs to be filled out, is if I can think beyond the immediacy of that event to how that paper is going to be used as part of the system as a whole, then I can make more informed decisions that hopefully will impact my practice, such as offering to provide site translation and being prepared to do site translation, which means that as part of my prep, I might want to explore what types of forms could possibly come up within the assignment, and making sure that I'm familiar with the information within the form so I'm ready to provide a site translation. And certainly there's no requirement that a deaf person use our site translation services, but my experience in offering it in a culturally appropriate manner, it's almost always taken advantage of. Consumers appreciate our willingness to do that. I personally see it as an integral part of our work as interpreters, and it would be an example of us using a more systems-oriented approach to our work. Next slide. Another thing about structures is that they can be, the structure of an organization is that it can be centralized or decentralized. And this is where the lines of authority within a system can become more apparent. So, you know, they can be organized around either of these. In a centralized approach, the ultimate authority or decision making is concentrated at the top layer of the organization. You know, so let's say you take a small commission for the deaf, for example, and usually any kind of fiscal decision that's going to be made, any kind of fiscal commitment that's going to be made in a smaller organization, it's going to be centralized, and there's only one, maybe two individuals that would have the authority to make a fiscal commitment or other types of commitments, like committing the organization to do something, to provide a particular kind of service, for example. In a decentralized system, then typically the lines of authority are, people have more autonomy, and it could be that they have the authority that goes along with making those kinds of decisions. And so I work in higher education, and you know, certainly what I do in directing the Marie Center is decentralized in that I have my own budget and I know what money and funds are available for doing the work that needs to be done, and I can make decisions about expenditures. But if it goes outside of my budget and it impacts the university's budget or it impacts other centers, then of course it would no longer be decentralized. I would have to go to others and have them participate in the decision making. So again, appreciating whether you're working within a centralized or decentralized system can help you to appreciate the amount of time that it may take to get a decision about something. You know, for example, as I said earlier, about having the team interpreter, or rescheduling an appointment, or, you know, any number of other things. The next slide. So processes, each system has approved policies and procedures that it must follow to remain in compliance with standards and regulations to which the system is accountable. Depending on the nature of the systems, the standards and regulations can be those set by the government, or in the case of my institution, which is a state university, not only the government, but external accreditation standards, accreditation agencies, laws, among other sources. So this is a concept that really is familiar to interpreters in that although we apply discretion in our decision making, our decisions are still expected to conform to the ethical standards set by the profession. So, you know, within the range of decisions we make, they all have to be acceptable within that ethical framework that surrounds our decisions, right? So this notion of having processes that we have to refer to, or certain standards that we have to refer to as we're implementing our job, is one that should be relatively familiar to us. And if we fail to comply with ethical standards of practice, then there's a system within our system, our larger system of interpreting services. There's a system where grievances could be filed and interpreters could be reprimanded or disciplined for breaches. So again, understanding the processes of the systems in which you're working is really essential for systems thinking because it allows us to more fully appreciate why the personnel in that system behave in certain ways or engage in certain acts and why certain structures exist within the system. So just a very simple example is the act of healthcare professionals washing their hands before having contact with the patient or putting on gloves. That one act right there is grounded in policies and procedures that exist because of laws or standards that exist regarding safety. Safety not only of patients but also of practitioners. Next slide. So again, why is this even important to us as interpreters? Well, if we embrace the idea that our work as interpreters is socially constructed, meaning that it occurs within the context of human interactions and it's impacted by all of the factors that exist in a particular context in which our work is happening, then the more we know about that context, about the situation in which that context occurs, then the more effective we can be in managing the range of variables that are available to us. So systems thinking is a perspective that helps us see the events that occur within a system and the patterns in that system in a new light, and we can respond to them less reactionary. We can respond to them in a higher leverage manner because we understand why it's happening. We understand its source, and that gives us ideas. And as we watch the individuals that work within that system and we watch how they problem solve and how they navigate through the system, we can replicate that behavior and utilize that in a way that expedites our own navigation through the system. So in the next few slides, I'm going to provide pictures that can just stimulate some of your own thinking about systems in which you might work. And
welcome to Go To Training. Online training made easy. There are 131 other callers on the call.
Pictures is to stimulate your thinking about these elements that we've been talking about. So the first slide. So in this first slide, we've got a classroom setting, and it represents a scenario that involves a deaf Latino student who attends a residential school for the deaf, but is mainstreamed for a high school chemistry class. And so just take a moment to think about these questions. So people who are part of this educational system, just think about all the people that you might encounter. And what does each of them do? Not only those that you see in the picture, the teacher, for example, but also those who are involved but not in the picture. And how does the personnel interface with one another to accomplish the goals of that classroom? And how does what's happening in that classroom relate to what's happening within the broader system? How does it relate to what happened in that classroom with these students the day before, a week before? How might it relate to what's coming up later? Okay. How would you as the interpreter fit in most effectively with the people that are within that system? What's the structure of that system? Both the structure used within the classroom and the broader structure in which the classroom exists. How is the fact that the student for whom you're interpreting moves in and out of this particular system, this public school setting, because they also are schooled in the residential school? And what are the implications of that transition from the one school to the other? What's the implications for that student? What's the implications for the classroom that they're in right now? What's the implication for you as an interpreter? What processes are in place and evidenced in the policies and procedures that people seem to be following? And how might even the content the teacher is teaching, how might that be tied to curricular standards, regulations within the system in which he's operating? And what's the implication of that for this student? How does it influence their behavior, their actions? And how do they potentially impact you as an interpreter? So considering these kinds of questions and the related answers expands your awareness of the system, how it operates, and gives you a deeper appreciation for what things may influence what happens within your work and how meaning is created, but also how you can fit in more effectively with the goals of the system. The next picture. So this scenario represents one, no, we need to go back one, please. Back one. Thank you. So this scenario represents a scenario that involves an interpretation that's being delivered remotely through technology. This is a remote interpreted event, and it involves a deaf person who works for a small IT firm, and the focus of the meeting is the employee's annual performance evaluation. So consider what you know or may need to learn about the personnel that are involved in that meeting and the structures that exist and reflect the overall organization, the logic of the system, the processes that are followed in implementing that employee's evaluation. Consider how each of these elements interface and are interdependent, and the implication of all of that for your work as an interpreter. Next slide. So in this scenario, you're going to be interpreting for a deaf patient. She's a first-time mom, first time she's ever had an ultrasound, and the physician has some concerns about the development of the baby. So again, think about those three elements of people, personnel, who are involved, the structures that exist, the processes that are guiding the behavior and actions of the people that are involved in that system. One more slide, the next one, one more picture. And then this final scenario, you're interpreting for a preliminary hearing in a civil case, and you're interpreting for the plaintiff. Right? So again, you can consider all three of those elements. How what is happening in that moment relates to the broader structure that exists, how the processes in that moment relate to other processes that are going to occur, and you can expand your appreciation for how to function and navigate by paying attention to the way the people in that system relate to one another, relate to the policies and procedures, etc. So again, these looking at these kinds of pictures are ways that can stimulate our thinking. Next slide. So how does that really change what we do? So again, as mentioned earlier, our role is socially constructed because it's embedded in human interactions. So our ability to exercise decisions is really relational. It's bound to the contexts in which we work and how we fit in, not just conceptually, but pragmatically, you know, in the moment, what's happening and how it comes together within that particular context. And as we apply a systems perspective in approaching our work, we can begin to see patterns in various systems, and we can gain a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness between different aspects of the system. We can better appreciate why the personnel in the system behave and act in certain ways. We can view the processes that are followed from a broader perspective. We learn that what happens in one part of the system almost always has implications for another part of the system. Instead of seeing our work from the limited perspective of the moments that were there immediately, we begin to understand how what happens in the moments that we are interpreting has implications well beyond the immediacy of that event. And this has implications for our ability to create meaning, to generate clear, coherent interpretations. And it opens up our awareness to high leverage interventions because it fosters our ability to collaborate with members of the system. So instead of having these low impact reactions to what's going on because we don't understand it and we feel somehow it's counter to what we need to happen, we look for ways to fit into the system, to collaborate, to navigate in the same way that the others in the system navigate. And therefore create higher leverage ways of solving problems. And in the process, we're much more open and transparent and authentic in how we do our work. Next slide. So returning again to this historic view versus the emergent views of our role, approaching interpreting from a systems perspective allows us to approach our work in a much more contextual manner, one that allows us to focus on the settings in which we work with an expanded realization of how to fit in and more awareness of the resources and the solutions that would be available to us. And this shifts us again from that position of reacting and trying to defend this very narrow and limited view of our work to seeking ways to fit into context so that we are back to doing what we should have always been doing, and that's fostering relationship and connection between the people that rely on our services. We are constantly, instead of always talking about being detached or aloof, which leaves people thinking that our uninvolvement means that we're not paying attention, we communicate something just the opposite of that. We are very actively engaged and paying very close attention to all that's happening and using our thinking, our systems thinking, to anticipate how what's happening right now relates to other pieces and how we can foster better collaboration and problem solving. Next slide. And so this then can actually impact our own professional practices and our own professional acts because it allows us to continually assess if what we're doing makes sense or if it fits within the system, right? So by learning to adapt to and adopt much more of the system behavior, or as much of the system behavior as possible, for example, the jargon, the value and respect for its processes, the knowledge of how things work and why, then we can serve the needs of deaf people more effectively. And as well, this same ability enhances our ability, as I said, to convey meaning and nuance so that deaf people can also more effectively navigate the system themselves. Next slide. So, two important system principles that I want to reinforce as we're starting to bring this to a close is first a reminder that the system's overall behavior depends on its overall structures. The more complex the system is, the more formal the behavior is going to be, right? And the more formal the behavior, the potentially greater demands that we're going to encounter. So that's why I think we're seeing more and more people seeking to specialize in our field. It takes a long time to really understand the nature of systems, right? And how a system operates. So people who specialize tend to work more predominantly in one setting or one or two settings than others. So, you know, it could be legal interpreting, healthcare interpreting, educational interpreting. This movement towards specialization gives further evidence to the importance of thoroughly knowing how a system works so that you can be the most effective within that system. The second principle is that there is a circular relationship between the overall system and its part. Look for what creates, when you go into the system, look for what creates that circular nature. Earlier I mentioned the role of paperwork. That's an example of a circular, meaning that paperwork moves with the individual through the system and it comes back again, it shows up again. It's added to over time. It needs to be updated from time to time. Consider what other processes or structures foster this circular relationship. Next slide. So then back again to the classroom. So think about the role of scaffolding that occurs in K through 12 curriculum and how in elementary grades, from first grade to second grade to third grade, the same subjects are repeated year after year, but always at a deeper level as students move from one grade to the next. And think about how that content builds on previous content and previously established concepts. So that's another example of a circular quality to a system. Think about what others might exist in a classroom setting or in an educational setting. Next slide. Annual appraisals and other forms of employee assessment provide an example of one of the circular elements associated with an HR system, right? They're used as a reference point for where an employee is in relationship to their job position and the expectations of that job. They frame what expectations will be used to assess an employee's effectiveness, and often they're tied to a system of pay increases. So again, think of what other circular elements might exist within the system. Next slide. Think about this healthcare scenario and what creates the circular nature of these types of healthcare appointments. Again, thinking about the record, how will the results of this test that's being administered be reported. Figuring out what constitutes the circular nature and keeps elements of the system tied to one another, again, will give you insight into the patterns that are inherent in that system, and that helps you to anticipate what's going to happen as you go into a new system, or go back into that system. I don't mean new system. You go back into the same system, but for a new appointment or for a new assignment. Next slide. Again, this is the courtroom. What are the circular patterns? You know, so I certainly think in the criminal justice system, the criminal portion of the legal system, I think about how often an individual's rights are referenced, and how proceeding after proceeding in a larger criminal proceeding, or appearance after appearance in a broader criminal proceeding, will reference those rights. And so sometimes as interpreters, we might want to think, well, they've heard this before, so I don't need to treat it with as much attention this time. I would suggest that that circular nature gives us an opportunity to one more time look for ways to be explicit in conveying information, because in my own experience, even though something may be repeated again and again, someone may understand it in a way that they didn't understand it before. So again, you can use pictures like this one and the previous ones to stimulate your thinking about systems, about the three elements of people, structures, and processes, as well as identifying what about the system is circular and what about this scenario represents how this event that's happening right now is tied to the broader system in which it's situated. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that our autonomy, meaning our authority over our work, is relational. And it's true that it's relational because much of our authority actually in how we get to implement our role is directly tied to the system in which we're working. You know, so for example, legal interpreters are designated as officers of the court, and K through 12 interpreters are considered a part of the educational team. So again, systems thinking is a way in which we can more fully appreciate our decision latitude. So I'll just give another example that illustrates it even more. So we go all the way in the legal setting. We may see our role as the same no matter where we are, but the system doesn't, right? Because I just talked about the court viewing the interpreter as an officer of the court, and as an officer of the court, the interpreter is treated equally to attorneys. So it means that I could approach the judge, I could ask to interrupt the proceedings, to make comment to the judge, to ask for assistance from the judge. It also means I have a duty to the court that is very different than, it involves much more than how I might see my duty as an interpreter according to the Code of Ethics. So I would, if there were any barrier to my being able to do my job, I would have a duty to report that to the court, right? I would say that K through 12 interpreters have a similar aspect. They're part of the educational team. They're employees of the school. And so they too have a duty to report anything that's a barrier to their work. Conversely, you go to video relay services, and the level of autonomy, the level of authority the interpreter exercises over their work is once again determined in part. It's relational. So we know that there are FCC standards and there are corporate company standards that determine the degree of latitude that the interpreter has to make decisions. So all of this is, again, supports the notion that we need to better appreciate systems, the way they work, and how we fit in with those systems. Next slide. These are the takeaway messages that I hope you'll leave with. Systems thinking can empower interpreters to recognize that our role is socially constructed and to find new ways of appreciating and relating to the systems in which we work. It expands our options or our controls because it includes not only things that we've thought of as interpreters, but the range of system-based practices and acts that professionals in that system use to resolve problems and to navigate the system. And we can use those in addition to our interpreter-centric acts. Next slide. So again, system thinking provides us with another way to think about, certainly not the only way, it's another way to think about and talk about and approach our work. And it's a perspective that gives us a bigger picture orientation to what we do. And in our next webinar on Monday, February 24th, we're going to look at vocational rehabilitation as a system and the implications of that system for how we function as interpreters within that system. So I'm going to open it up to questions and answers, and I also encourage all of you to participate in the next webinar on February 24th. Carrie, are you going to be facilitating the questions?
I can, or you may read them and then read them out loud, whichever one you would like to do.
So I'm trying to see, can you scroll back and see, are there questions that have already been asked?
There was only one question that was asked previously, and that was, how would this change if you are the ongoing interpreter versus the sub-interpreter or a one-time interpreter?
Yes, I think that a systems thinking approach works for both. I think that if I'm that one-time interpreter that moves into that system, that if I can enter it with a systems thinking approach, I'm going to be better prepared for whatever happens. If I'm that interpreter that, and so if I'm that one-time interpreter, if it helps me only to the extent that I can appreciate how what's happening right now relates to the rest of the system, how other things may have happened that inform what's happening right now, and how what's happening right now may have a life beyond my being there, right? Then it's going to help me to hear information differently and understand the meaning differently, perhaps to ask for clarification more readily, and to seek to create an interpretation that fits dynamically into the system as a whole. So if it only helps with how I construct meaning in that moment, it's a great tool. If you're the long-term interpreter and you're seeking ways to make sure that services to deaf people are as streamlined as possible and that there's continuity of care, continuity of services, interpreting services, then for sure, on many levels, it's going to be a great addition. I also saw a question. Could you back it up a bit, Carrie? Because I thought I saw an earlier question that was something about allies.
That question is, do you think another way to become less interpreter-centric is to find an ally, deaf or hearing, within the system? She may not necessarily understand what we do, but would be able to answer some questions, lend some type of technical support, such as preparation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so, for example, if you think about K through 12 interpreters, a fairly common complaint is that they don't get prep materials from the teachers. But if I, as the interpreter, demonstrated to that teacher that I more fully understood the role of lesson planning, the role of state standards in terms of what gets taught in the classroom, and I could demonstrate appreciation for what that teacher has to do to meet those standards, then my request for prep material is a natural part of the educational process, the educational planning process. In the same way the teacher has to prepare, if my job is to support what the teacher is doing, I have to prepare. And so it becomes a collaborated planning between the two of us rather than this isolated request that comes from me and almost seems like a demand, and it seems autonomous from what the teacher is doing, right? And then certainly in terms of finding an ally, being an ally to that person in terms of helping them segue into serving deaf people, and seeking an ally to help you navigate the system and to understand the system better, that's great. So what you're calling an ally, I think of as what I was referencing as a more collaborative model of interpreting. We use that term ally in a lot of different ways as interpreters, and we've even coined the term in our field of an ally model, interpreter as ally. And I totally understand what that looks like and what that means when I'm not interpreting, but we don't have a lot that's been written or talked about or studied about what does that look like in application. I think some of what we've been talking about in terms of system thinking tonight could apply to this notion of being an ally as an interpreter, but I wouldn't want to mislabel this as interpreter as ally. That's the model I'm talking about. I'm talking about just the concept of system thinking and how it could help us. And I'm hesitant about the use of the word ally, because I'm not sure we all share a common understanding of what it means or how it gets applied, what it looks like when we do it. I think we have time for one more, and then I need to turn it over to Carrie to...
Earlier you said in the example of the radiology technician asking the interpreter, how does this work? That we explain it. Some deaf consumer would prefer to explain our role to the systems people themselves. How is it best handled when it's explained like a conduit model, interpreter model, or something like that?
Yes, and so then, that would be great to know in advance, right? If they're a consumer that you've worked with regularly and you know that, then that's perfect, because then all the interpreter has to do is interpret that, and then the deaf person starts explaining it, and the question gets answered either way, right? So perhaps checking in with the deaf person beforehand and finding out what their preference is, if they want to do those types of explanations, or If you didn't check in beforehand and it's happening right now, that you sort of look to the deaf person, you interpret it and wait a second to see if they want to respond, and if they don't, then you go ahead and respond. Well, okay. I think that at the, Carrie, I don't know. Well, just let me say that you can contact me at anna.witter, W-I-T-T-E-R, hyphen, Merithew, M-E-R-I-T-H-E-W, at unco.edu. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that remain. I'll ask Carrie if there are other questions to remain. Maybe we can sort of post that generally so everyone has the benefit of those answers. I thank you for your time this evening. I want to let you know that the NCIC and our activities are funded by grants from the U.S. Department of Education, Rehabilitation Services Administration. And Carrie, I'll let you wrap it up.
Well, thank you, Anna, for the amazing information that you've presented tonight. I'd also like to thank our interpreters, CM and Hal, and our captionist, Rochelle, and of course, the entire NCIEC team that made this all possible. For CEUs, there is the survey link under the materials for participants, as well as I will be sending it out tomorrow morning. You need to know that I will be checking on participants who show up and the time that they are logged in to the CEU requests. So it's very important that you log in for the entire webinar. If there are technical issues, we do record these webinars, and the information is there for you to access at another time if technology did not allow you to view the whole webinar. For individual viewers, like I said, the survey will be sent out in an email tomorrow morning, or you can find the link there in the column where all the information is listed, and you'll see under materials. The survey includes evaluation and CEU's questions. If you watch in a group, please forward the survey to individuals in your group so everyone has a chance to fill out the survey. Registration forms will be matched up with lists of attendees, as I have mentioned before. It can take up to 8 weeks for the CEUs to be posted to your transcripts for this event. If you watch this in a group, in the email that I sent previously today, there is a sign-in sheet. Please have everyone sign in on the sign-in sheet, even if they're not requesting CEUs. Please have everyone fill out a survey if possible. The sign-in sheet needs to be emailed to me at carolyn.white@unco.edu by Wednesday at 5 o'clock Mountain Time. Individuals earning CEUs will be emailed a certificate of completion within 2 weeks, because on the form you can request it. If you are not filling out a group form and you want a certificate of completion, please email me and I will send you a certificate. And I think that's it, and I hope to see all of you next month. If you have any questions, please email me. And thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.